I would like to take the opportunity to respond to a comment or two, and the aggregate of them from my last video, and perhaps offer a bit of attainable hope. Specifically, I'm talking about these comments. And no, I'm not trying to make an example out of anyone. These are legitimate points of view. Tar Starkuz writes, "The problem with giving these people a judicious application of our wrath is that they are the ones with all the power. This is not a fad, it is deeply entrenched. It didn't start 6 years ago. Lest you think it cannot go on, I suggest you read up on the Cultural Revolution in China." Honest John writes, "I'm no fan of Trump, but the failure of the MAGA red wave has made the woke revolution almost complete. They have little to fear from the democratic process now. I don't know how the pendulum swings back for the foreseeable future. They've utterly neutralized the democratically elected, tepidly not quite woke enough opposition the British electorate voted in on a landslide, without having to win an election. The pendulum keeps swinging towards wokery." So let me address all this more or less as it comes to me. I would say I will try not to go in too deep or off on too many tangents, but I've also learned that for those who like that sort of thing, this could be the sort of thing you like. I can understand people being disappointed, even disheartened by the so-called red wave failing to manifest itself. But just because something didn't win as big as expected, that doesn't mean it's a loss. The other thing is the red wave may not have happened as big as expected during the midterm elections, simply because they were the midterm elections. Sure, you want people to treat all elections as an opportunity for change, but a lot depends on what or who the voter thinks is the problem. People may have been of the mind, wrong or not, that the best way to fix things is during the main event of the presidential election year, especially if people mainly see Biden as the problem, or at least the figurehead for the problem. They might be just keeping their powder dry. When things go down, they often don't go down on schedule. Don't assume because things don't happen on schedule that they aren't going to happen. I'm not sure why anyone feels the need to say I'm no fan of Trump. I doubt many people are. I'm pretty sure that much of Trump's appeal isn't that he is Trump as such, but whether or not you can actually consider him a populist, at least he's not more of the same. That's to say, the prospect of Hillary Clinton becoming president as more of the same, a figure anointed by the establishment, mired in corruption, much of it recent and more stretching far back into her past, the great white hope of the elite, has as much to do with Donald Trump becoming president as Donald Trump. Really, what got Trump elected wasn't that he's Donald Trump, but that he wasn't Hillary Clinton. You can see a lot of the outrage over Donald Trump as not being all that much about Donald Trump or anything he did. It notably isn't, but outrage that the public could reject their agenda. And of course, anything that isn't their agenda must be racist, sexist, trans and homophobic, and perhaps even the machinations of foreign agents. Whether or not any of these accusations are factual, the acceptance of him is a rejection of them, and they think they're everything that is good and right and mandatory. Sometimes they have to fortify their point, such as accusing Trump of being racist for saying Mexicans are animals, which was derived from the MSM editing a comment he made about the vicious MS-13 gang to make it appear he was talking about people crossing the southern border in general. One of the most amusing and disturbing things on YouTube are man-in-the-street interviews where people in some blue enclave are asked about Trump, whether he's racist or homophobic. These people will adamantly declare that Trump is the worst kind of hood-wearing, cross-burning racist, and gay basher, but when asked what he specifically said or did that was either, they will get a blank look in their eyes as they search memory for examples and blink as they come up empty. Then they get angry and fall back on more amorphous, lesser charges such as Trump fuels racism or homophobia, whatever that's supposed to mean. If prejudice is forming an opinion of a person or group based on preconceived notions unsupported by facts and evidence, then these people are clearly prejudiced. Ami Horowitz, and thanks to Mama Bear K for standing in for my long-term memory on his name, does more straight man-in-the-street style interviews. Will Witt of PragerU, I believe, added the twist of soliciting comments from people on how racist or homophobic Trump was, and then brought along a black or gay friend to tell them they're full of shit. You can almost see people's clockwork seizing, torn between wanting to scream at someone, yet knowing they should be deferential to a protected class. Although I can't confirm this. These videos are really hard to find unless you use very specific search terms, as YouTube has them throttled, shadow banned, or whatever you call it when they pack the top result with MSNBC panels confidently declaring Trump a racist in the most expressionistic fashion, yet never getting down to specifics, or promoting the idea that if people of a certain shade think you're racist, then you must be racist. If you search for asking people on the street if Trump is racist, you get some unintelligibly irrelevant results like Joe Biden calls President Donald Trump one of the most racist presidents in history, or Don Lemon asks Maggie Haberman if she believes Trump is a racist, and then Donald Trump's private racism revealed by Michael Cohen. And those are from CNBC, CNN, and some outfit called Now This News, respectively. These people in the business of telling people what to think is clearly the basis for where these people in the street got their prejudices. Now, you might claim that this ability to generate and promote politically expedient lies and suppress everything else is a kind of cultural revolution. But the media was cranking this stuff out. Talking heads were calling people names long before and all during the 2016 election, and Donald Trump still got elected. It must be so frustrating to have all the power of the printing press, even a monopoly on it, and still having people using your penny dreadful to wrap fish or wipe their asses. I'm not convinced the Cultural Revolution is an apt comparison, because there's a great gulf between having a lot of power, even an extraordinary amount of power, and having all the power. The difference between having a lot of power and having all the power necessary for a real cultural revolution is the difference between persuading people to do something by fair means or fallacious, and simply being able to make them do it. Whenever people don't get their way, that almost certainly means while they may have a lot of power, they certainly don't have all of it. I am aware that wokeism isn't a fad of the last few years. It's been slowly shaping itself and putting out tendrils, starting in academia for decades. First was in the rebranding of Marxism as its failures and atrocities became too manifest for its supporters to go on without tweaking class struggle in terms of racial and sexual grievance politics, as well as in the growth of postmodernism and radical subjectivism, which I first noticed coming out of sociology, the softest of the soft sciences, when people like Paul Feyerabend came out with his academic bestseller Against Method, which co-opted critiques in the history and philosophy of science by Thomas Kuhn contained in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He used Kuhn's historicist critique of the scientific method, that there was no such thing as dispassionate, objective science divested from the social structures in which it existed. As Kuhn put it, there is no observation that is not theory-laden. That quote is probably on a coffee mug in some subjectivist merch store. Like playing telephone, the message became more and more distorted. People then co-opted Feyerabend, co-opting Kuhn, to prove everything subjective and relative and therefore equally lacking in worth, which was probably not what Kuhn or Feyerabend intended. Now, everything was bullshit, with one bit of bullshit just as good as any other bit of bullshit, but predictably, people tended to think their bullshit was better than all that other bullshit. Ignoring the fact that if everything is bullshit, then your bullshit is bullshit. Even the claim that everything is bullshit is, you guessed it, bullshit. And knowledge ended up as both one of the most overvalued and denigrated of concepts. My first real WTF moment, when this started being cashed in the real world, came with the introduction of women's way of knowing into philosophy in the late 1980s. Women, spelt with a Y, of course, which affirmed as a matter of epistemology that what women felt actually counted not only as a form of knowledge, but damn near epistemic certitude. And not long after that, in the mid-90s, was the Sokal hoax, in which a paper was submitted for peer review and publication by physics professor Alan Sokal. It was written in the language of postmodern bullshit, and despite its central argument that gravity was a social construct, it was accepted by an academic journal, Social Text. The title of the paper submitted, which reads like sniggering postmodernist crack, being Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. Look it up. It's hilarious. This has been going on for a long, long time. You don't have to tell me. Clearly, this is the origin of the lack of intellectual framework we exist in, where truth isn't something that needs to be proven by agreed-upon methods. It's largely a matter of being whatever you can make people believe, or worse, what you can make them feel. Which is why any standards for determining the truth, of evaluating evidence, even the idea that there is a correct answer, even in mathematics, is reflexively attacked as supremacist or patriarchal. Not because the answers are biased, but because they are not value-laden according to the detractor's agenda. Everything has to work for them, even if it has absolutely nothing to do with them. Epistemic, as in epistemology, is simply related to knowledge and things derived from it, such as what you can know and how you can know it. Epistemic nihilists, those who propose that we can't know anything, throw themselves on their own sword. If you can't know anything, how can you know that you can't know anything? And if you know that you can't know anything, isn't that knowing something? They end up spinning around like a dust devil until they disappear up their own ass. This is to say that the two-tiered hypocrisy of the woke, they're having to resort to special pleading so the rules they apply to others don't apply to them, isn't a strength. It's a weakness. In fact, it's self-negating. They can only do what they do by playing Calvin ball, changing the rules as they go. All of this, unlike blue checkmark's hysterical fears about free speech, is very, very dangerous. If you claim that nothing is true, or everything is true, then the only line of demarcation that can be drawn is whether you like something, whether it serves your purposes or it doesn't. The idea of an inconvenient truth simply doesn't exist. When the idea of independent, objective truth no longer exists, then the only metric is the subjectivity of self-interest and political expediency. Once you've had enough and demand everyone play by the same rules, impose the most basic sense of fairness and reciprocity, then they've lost, unless they can resort to force. And considering how that has played out, will play out, they might really want to consider whether they want to do that very, very carefully. Although you can draw comparisons between the Cultural Revolution and wokeism, as they do share a lot of similarities, and is probably something aspirational for the woke, as yet we have not put people into re-education camps and shot them in the back of the head for not complying. Not that they wouldn't, but the woke don't have that kind of power. And if they ever got that kind of power, they don't have the balls for the backlash. A lot of difference exists between what the woke can do, which is to have tantrums over this fact of history and that, and occasionally pull down a statue, and what the Chinese did. The Chinese engaged in sweeping historical revisionism from the bottom up, even destroying artifacts and traditions so no one had any frame of reference. The Cultural Revolution didn't limit its power to denigrating or ostracizing people. People who didn't comply were imprisoned and murdered, and that too is a very different thing. I don't even know if we can draw any conclusions from comparisons between the British and American systems. The British lack a codified set of rights and liberties, although they are said to have an unwritten constitution. They rely on interpretations of precedents set in common and case law, which may serve to make them think rights are something the government grants. They have a far more elitist and politicized judicial system, and generally have a much smaller rudder with which to change course than Americans do. In the United States, just within a year, we have seen the Supreme Court look to the Constitution to undo precedents and policies so long established they seemed unassailable. The court overturned Roe v. Wade on the basis that its claim that there was a right to privacy inherent in the Constitution and that this right was in any way applicable to abortion was so hopelessly flawed that it amounted to a judicial fiction. And that's without getting into the weeds of whether such slogans as "my body, my choice," when talking about a pregnant woman and her fetus, which are two genetically distinct individuals, carries any weight at all. Rather than abortion being banned, as so many shrieked, it just lost status as a federally protected right, and the decisions regarding the practice deferred to the states. Some states have long practiced extensive time, place, and manner restrictions on the purchase, possession, and carrying of firearms, all of which are subsumed in the Second Amendment by the word bear, as in bear arms. States had previously been given such free rein to implement these kind of restrictions that they basically invalidated what was supposed to be a federally protected right. The court has recently come around to viewing these restrictions as a complete overreach of power, so arbitrary and unevenly applied that they become a form of corruption, as is apparent if you notice who gets to possess, much less carry, a firearm in New York. So, the court continues to affirm the idea that the only license, the only permit that a citizen should require is the Second Amendment itself. More and more states following suit have turned to constitutional carry, codifying that idea into law. Meanwhile, restrictive states continue to double down, passing even more restrictions to ensure that people don't have a firearm any time or any place where they might actually need one to defend themselves or others. The point is, those restrictive states have a lot of power, much of it of the ill-intentioned and unaccountable kind. But they don't have all the power. Abortion and gun rights have been re-evaluated despite those with vast political, social, and media power endlessly banging away at the same old slogans and fear and hysteria-soaked talking points. And so, extrapolating from what is happening in Britain to be at all relevant to what must happen in America is overlooking the important distinction that where power can be centralized, even entrenched in the British system, the American system is based on a distrust of power and a structure to guarantee that although you can acquire a whole lot of power, you can't get all the power. And some power will always remain out of reach as protected, inalienable individual rights. Anyone who claims the government gives us rights and therefore can take them away has no idea what is meant by inalienable right. Sure, you can claim that those with power, or those who want power, can try to subvert constitutional rights, chip away at them. What is also true is that often the Bill of Rights is the rocks that they can dash themselves to death on. What some people really have a problem comprehending is that the founders of the United States, in signing the Declaration of Independence and then 13 years later ratifying the Constitution, actually set up and approved a system that severely limited their own power. They had to, just to prove that they were not the tyrants that had just been overthrown. Historians place the American ideological and political revolution between 1765 and 1791. The fighting proper was the 8 long and bloody years between 1775 and 1783. What would have happened if one of these founders popped a crown on his head and anointed himself king? You know what would have happened, and so did they. Look at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which marks the transition of the American colonies from a disorganized insurrection into a full-blown revolution. I've been to Lexington and Concord. Every American school kid with a field trip in striking distance has been there. The whole place is well preserved and events regularly reenacted. I've stood on Lexington Battle Green, the commons where some disgruntled colonists finally had enough, were absolutely up to here with that shit, and decided to provoke a shooting war against what was then the greatest military power on earth. Standing there, you can still hear echoes of the shot heard round the world. What happened was the British were long rumored to raid a colonial arsenal in Concord, Massachusetts. Any vestigial element of surprise was lost due to Paul Revere's midnight ride warning of the British approach. The colonists confronted the 700 British Army regulars on the march in those commons at Lexington. As with the Boston Massacre, someone's trigger finger got a bit itchy and lead began to fly. When the smoke literally cleared, 1 Brit and 8 colonists were killed. As before, the colonists got the shit end of the stick, and that really, really pissed them off. Not knowing to get while the getting was good, the British Army continued on to Concord as that was, as Heath Ledger's Joker would say, all part of the plan. What wasn't part of the plan was the British realizing that everyone knew their plan for so long, or at least anticipated it, that when they got to the arsenal, it was empty. The arms and supplies long since moved elsewhere. Like Captain Scott in the Antarctic, reaching their goal was a defeat that would be overshadowed by what faced them going back the way they came. The colonists, pissed off as they were, absolutely used the British for target practice. Even though the British were reinforced under fire to some 1,700 men, the colonists picked them off from behind trees and barns or any place they could shoot from. The British lost 73 men, which isn't exactly a rout or a significant percentage of their forces. But the way they lost them was terrifying and demoralizing in a way that only an occupying force can really appreciate. See America in Vietnam. See also learning fuck all from your own history. And if that wasn't bad enough for the British, the Battle of Bunker Hill was yet to come to demonstrate exactly what kind of shit show they were in for. The battle, as everyone likes to point out, mainly took place around Breed's Hill. This is where the phrase, "don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes," comes from. But the colonists weren't just aiming for effect, but with a purpose. The battle cost the colonists some 140 militia. The British cashed in about 1,054 soldiers, a disproportionate number of them officers. If you looked fancy, the colonists made a point to shoot you. Even though the colonists ran out of ammunition and had to retreat, and the British gained the ground and a technical victory. As British General Clinton wryly put it, a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. The British, to their credit, eventually realized this was an untenable situation, something that doesn't always occur to occupiers in good time. Although they may have been able to force the colonies to submit if they had thrown even more blood and treasure into it, they realized all they could win was being an occupying army over a colony that no longer wanted them and were not averse to making that known. This should have been clear from the symbolism of the colonists toppling a statue of King George III and melting it down to make musket balls. All this is more than just American history, the tales we tell. It is our origin story. It is the foundations on which we stand. I don't think anything recent has shown the differences between the American-British systems and their perceptions like the Johnny Depp defamation trials. Obviously, different parties were involved in that. Depp sued the Sun newspaper in the UK and Amber Heard directly in the US. But the UK trial was left up to a single entrenched and highly politicized judge, Andrew Nicol, a functionary of the state who always gave the sense that the decision he rendered had one eye on the evidence as presented and another on public perception and possible reactions when you don't believe all women regardless. Nicol's jurisprudence was so steeped in prejudicial thinking that where much of the testimony provided by Johnny Depp was discounted, according to Nichols because he was a drug and alcohol user and abuser, this was not applied to Amber Heard, who obviously knew her way around $500 bottles of wine, mushrooms, and nose candy. Although the British legal system is supposedly adversarial like the American one, in practice, the Johnny Depp UK trial was conducted in a far more inquisitorial manner. The outcome determined through the judge questioning witnesses and by what answers he felt were important and those which he summarily dismissed. From comments I both read and solicited at the time, the British were far more likely to disparage the American trial as a circus or the Colosseum, thinking that as long as a dozen or so carefully selected people sat in their galleries, that counted as a public trial. And if the media acted as a filter for what was said and shown in the trial, they thought that fulfilled the public's right to know. Based on the often ridiculous disparity between what happened in the U.S. trial and what the entrenched mainstream media reported, both twisting facts and engaging in lies of omission, I think shows that assurance on the part of some British commenters is largely a delusion. The Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution doesn't make bench trials the norm. Trial by jury is a given unless requests otherwise are made. The Sixth Amendment is just chock full of rights. In less than 100 words, it establishes the right to a speedy trial, a public trial, a jury trial by an impartial jury, the right of the accused to confront their accuser, to produce witnesses on behalf of the accused, and the right of the accused to counsel. The courts have increasingly interpreted the idea of a public trial to mean not just some of the public, but all of those who wish to observe, and that has meant televised trials. Which is only fair considering that Amber Heard made her accusations against Johnny Depp in the most public way possible. And so it's only right that his exoneration was also done in such a public fashion. If people want to give a haughty sniff and dismiss a truly adversarial, even confrontational, court system open to the public as bread and circuses, they are welcome to do so. But I watched every minute of the Johnny Depp defamation trial in the U.S., and I can immediately recognize those who actually watched the trial and those content to have their information and opinions filtered through the media. The Johnny Depp trial was a revelation for many people. Not only did it present the idea of a male victim of domestic abuse, something not anticipated by the very gendered language of the domestic violence establishment, but a male recipient of domestic abuse who wasn't a cowering wimp, but a man doing the best he could in a situation that was impossible. The impossibilities including not being able to protect himself from the abuser's violence or their accusations. People were faced with a woman that they could not believe simply because she was positively unbelievable. The disparity between what was revealed in the trial and what was reported in the media made many people aware of the media manipulation at hand and went a long way towards discrediting the media, especially on this subject. In fact, many of the voices outraged over the trial were nothing more than the media shills unable to let go of their narrative and outraged that anyone would reject it. Despite their best efforts, many people changed their minds about Depp, and he received support from an overwhelming 90% of the public. And what can you say about the people who are so compromised that they have no choice but to desperately cling to the narrative? Or those people who blithely accept everything the media tells them, regardless of the evidence presented in the Johnny Depp trial? Those people are hopeless. As hopeless as people who claim so-and-so is an ist and a phobe only because the people on television who tell them what to think told them to think it. But as long as people have the option to actually pay attention, as long as there exists a system where people can, there is not only hope, but certainly there can be nothing like the Cultural Revolution. In my previous video, I had indicated the sense that the pendulum was swinging the other way, away from reflexive wokeness. Perhaps that's just a hope. Maybe it's just a hope that the swing has reached the top of its oscillation and it can't possibly have the energy to keep going. The answer to that question, whether or not the hope is real, has a lot to do with what motivates wokeism, drives it forward, empowers and emboldens people to carry its banner. I think one thing you can't say powers them is any deep sense of conviction. As I have said elsewhere, a lot of woke politics isn't driven by the thing in itself, such as compelled use of made-up pronouns, but out of a desire to put down other people and ostracize them, often for some short-term political gain. And their willingness to engage in violence doesn't make them brave. When they will only beat people down in the street or on social media, only when they greatly outnumber the person they are attacking, then they are simply goddamn cowards, regardless of how much they may flex. The thing in itself isn't nearly as important as gaining political power, which is often the aim of people once they realize they can position themselves in the bureaucracies of government and academia to make a living if they are not outright intent on raiding the public treasury. Think of it this way. The sort of people most adamant about the use of pronouns may be more interested in infesting the institutions so they can get their student loans forgiven or get universal basic income passed. People motivated by the desire for free shit are often not interested in taking any kind of loss, making any personal sacrifice, including taking one for the team. A cry-bully, by their very nature, pushes and attacks, as long as they can get away with it, and as long as they are at no risk. But the moment someone pushes back, they fold and play victim. It's pathetic, really. People like that won't do any more than you let them get away with. And opportunists as they are, tend to be lacking in enough conviction to take the hit. Once was a time when students didn't know much about their teachers' personal lives, certainly not the details of it. Teachers just didn't share that kind of information back when the point was education, not indoctrination. Back when I was in high school, we were surprised as anyone when one of our social studies teachers got busted for growing and distributing marijuana. These days, performative political theater would demand that he toke up in front of the class. And putting a limitation on what aspect of their lives, their orientation or their sex lives and their politics, is nothing new. Teachers had to do that with more or less stringency for a very, very long time. The only difference here is that we allow people, through their claimed protected status, to abandon protection for everyone else, including their students, and cross a line. A line that was obviously a step towards indoctrination. Part of any return to a sense of normalcy, whatever that is, has to at least provide that the rules apply to everyone. And one of the signature features of the sort of obsessive politicizing we recognize as woke is that there are rules, and the way they work it, and the way we allow them to, is that those rules apply to you, not to them. But also remember, these are the people willing to make others suffer for their convictions, not suffer themselves. Just make all of this classroom exhibitionism off bounds, regardless of someone's politics or orientation. If people refuse, they've just given the game away. Maybe, which is actually shocking considering recent experience, I am just holding out for the essential self-correction inherent in the decency of people. I'm sure that many people don't fault the aims of wokeness as much as they don't like the means by which the woke are willing to achieve those ends, which basically amounts to running around the house trying to kill a fly with sledgehammers and shotguns. People are tired of opportunistic upheaval, even riots, over people like Jacob Blake that simply don't bear inspection. After a while, the whole racially charged mantra of the unarmed black man starts wearing thin. What you hope people get out of this is not another racially charged mantra, but the motivation to take things on a case-by-case basis and not react before all the facts come in. And of course, that's something that some people are unwilling to do because the reactions matter to them, not the facts. If what we are seeing isn't the pendulum swinging the other way, and I don't know if that's a good thing depending on how far it swings the other way, but at least the momentum of the pendulum is slowing. We already see a sort of woke fatigue setting in. people can only take so much hysteria, so much of uncharitable interpretations, and so many outright lies. You see, all this insanity will end not when people rise up against it, but when people simply ignore it. You see, wokeism is essentially a form of narcissism adopted as group behavior. Narcissists want you to like them or hate them. Doesn't make any difference, they just like the attention. The only way to destroy them, to make them puddle like the Wicked Witch of the West, is to simply ignore them. Wokeism will end when we stop giving this pathology its narcissistic supply, at which point you can imagine that they will engage in even more administrative abuse. If possible, they will harness the power of the state to impose their will on people who would otherwise ignore them and commit the horrible sin of paying them no attention. And that's where you have to factor in your hope for the innate decency of the American public. You also have to factor in their guns. One of the watershed moments of the civil rights era was not the protests and the boycotts. It was the moment that Bull Connor stupidly turned fire hoses and set police dogs on protesters who were not only peaceful but dressed in their Sunday best. At that moment, you can almost picture the populace with their TV dinners on tray tables watching this and collectively saying, "That isn't right." One of the natural checks on widespread administrative abuse, some sort of cultural revolution where people are subject to coercive control by the state, is the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment isn't about hunting or even home defense. It was about all that tyranny I just talked about. It was adopted. Its very intent was as a safeguard against unchecked government tyranny. That is nothing one would want to encourage or even think about. But doing anything that could provoke a response by armed citizens has always been the third rail of American politics. This is why America has things like the Posse Comitatus Act, which was adopted back in 1878 and severely limits the use of federal military to enforce domestic policies. This was not made law simply because the people who wrote the bill were fine, upstanding people who agreed to curtail their own power, but because using the military to enforce policies, any policies, had all the makings of a total shit show. The real effect of the Second Amendment is to scare the bejesus out of the government whenever they have the urge to go that far. Woke has all the elements of tyranny already in place. Would people actually take arms against a tyrannical government? A woke government? We can't really know. But it does make you think. More importantly, it makes the government, or whoever would commit administrative violence using the government, think. In the United States, not only do we have more guns than people, but gun owners usually stockpile ammunition. Not because they're planning on being an insurgency, but because political and social winds, as well as manufacturing and market forces, cause fluctuations in the availability and pricing of ammunition. So people get while the getting is good. And we haven't even considered whether the military itself would turn on the government that sent it against its own people. It didn't happen in China, but it happened in Russia. You see, all these sort of scenarios involve what strategists could describe as playing for keeps, otherwise known as the whole enchilada. The reason why no one wants to be an occupier, especially of their own people, is because to win, an occupier has to win. All the occupied insurgency has to do is throw a monkey wrench into the works. Now, I don't want to make too much of this, but fighting a tyrannical government is steeped in American culture. It's more than our mythology. As I said, it's our origin story. And this is another thing that makes the United States distinct from other countries such as Britain. Especially since, in the fight against tyranny, the British were the tyrants. Suffice to say, occupying the United States through subversion is one thing, but attempting it through direct coercion, using force, as has been done in other countries, is simply goddamn stupid. All any group will succeed in by attempting that is their own destruction. You think mean tweets are bad? Wait until we lock and load. So enough of that. I don't think using the coercive control of the government to carry out a cultural revolution is a realistic prospect. Your mileage in your unarmed, pussy-whipped country who wasn't born out of the shocking defeat of the greatest military power on earth may vary. Now, I don't want to make a case for American exceptionalism, except that I want to make a case for American exceptionalism. America is different, and it's only by making people believe that America is different and then having them act on it that we can overcome the fatalism of assuming that the woke have already won. Because then they have. And it's not America alone that should believe this. All countries, all people have to draw from their own history, their own exceptionalism to fight against it. Wokeism doesn't attack people's history and traditions, their structures and symbols, by accident. It is central to their tactics of demoralization. People confident in who they are have no need for racial politics, prejudice, or supremacist movements, and they certainly don't need identity politics. If wokeism continues, it will continue as it always has, using the power of disapproval and social sanction to enforce its will. The problem is that people are really noticing that the punishments, say, for not putting pronouns in your bio, even if what you're against is compelled speech, is entirely disproportionate to the crime. People can recognize a witch hunt when they see one. And all it takes for a witch hunter to lose their power is for people to do nothing when they start pointing and shrieking accusations. And as I have said, this is largely a matter of what people are going to let them get away with, especially when it comes to two-tiered, hypocritical rules. And it comes down to whether a tyranny in the making is willing to use actually coercive tactics, real oppression and violence. And what happens when that happens and people become truly sick of that shit. And so any oppressive movement or government, woke or not, in this all or nothing scenario is already setting the stage for their own destruction. The only question is when people have had enough. I mean, what else are you going to do? Throw up your hands and say they've already won? Just lay down and die? Trust me, I know how easy that is. But is that really what you want? You know what the algorithm needs, so subscribe, like, comment, and share. And a heartfelt thank you to those of you supporting me on Patreon, PayPal, and Subscribestar. I really do need your help, and I appreciate you coming through for me.